excited to be here with Jamie to talk about the future of flex. Now, before we get into that, I guess a brief kind of background, just to tell the audience, if they're not too familiar with Industrious, just tell them what's Industrious.
So first, let me say, I actually have not met a lot of you because I really, over the years, I don't go to many conferences. I go probably one occupier one a year, one landlord one, and I've never been to Workspaces. And I'm really glad you guys invited me. I feel like this group has been amazing thus far. It's very well organized. The spot's beautiful. So thank you.
Awesome. Thanks.
We're the third largest flex workplace provider in the world. We work in IWG, are large and industrious, and then we are global and for better and worse, and we can get into this, we are the premium provider in the sector. So I can get into our business model, all sorts of things, but to keep it short, we're the third largest flex workplace provider in the world.
Flex co-working space, I guess the
Co-working,
term is,
suites,
yep.
Anything where you're basically allowing a company to buy their workplace on a subscription as a product instead of building it out and doing it themselves.
Yeah. So you started in 2012, right?
Yeah.
What made you want to get into the space?
I was the very brief founding story. I used to be a corporate lawyer and I was at a hedge fund, but actually I had a crisis of conscience and I was running the National College Scholarship Program for orphans of the Rwandan genocide in Rwanda, and our U.S. offices were in basically a shared workplace. Yeah. And I had the most important meeting of my life because I was meeting with the president of IKEA, who was the largest funder to the organization. And I go to prepare for my meeting with him. We need a big re-up. And it's like the conference room table was sticky, the light bulbs were out, and I felt super embarrassed. So I actually moved the meeting to a Le Pen Quotidien, basically a coffee shop. Yeah. And I was livid that night. I was just like, I cannot believe I'm paying for a workplace that I'm not proud of, to the point where when I have the most important meeting of my career, I'm holding it in a coffee shop across the street. And I figured there must be 50,000 companies that also want to take advantage of the sharing economy dynamics or have mid-size or smaller teams and need to do it on a sort of outsourced basis, but they want something they can feel great about and can feel proud of.
That's awesome. So it wasn't to elevate the world's consciousness that you didn't found it for that reason?
Oh man. Okay.
We're not going to go there.
We're not going to go bankrupt today. So
yes,
it is a complicated day for.
They were delisted this morning, but so 160 locations, and you guys have obviously grown quite significantly coming out of the pandemic, right? Partnership with CBRE. 160, is that the locations?
We're almost at 200 now, and yes, I think we were pretty large before the pandemic, but that's probably and I don't want to sound promotional, but this has been the period of biggest growth for us. So we've had about 300% revenue growth since 2019, and I think have been the beneficiary about a lot of the trends in workplace and some of the sort of puts and takes in what's been going on in the flex industry.
So just back to the term, right? So flex space, hybrid space, co-working. What is the term we're looking for moving forward? Flex? Is that what you want Industrious to be known as?
I think the most accurate, but it's a mouthful, so it's never going to take, is workplace as a service. I actually think if you just think about what it is, that's the most accurate description. You're allowing someone to buy their workplace as a service, and it follows a lot of the same dynamics as other outsourcing or as a service industries, where you do it yourself usually, and then you start to say, okay, in my far-flung offices, or I store let's say it's 15 years ago, I store all my data on my own servers. Okay, but I'm going to use Amazon Web Services for this, or in this country, and then that sort of goes from there. And not to belabor the point, but the reason I think that as a service concept is really helpful is because it tells you a lot about how to use a flex provider and what over time has determined the winners and losers in flex. Because if you look at other outsourcing industries, they are always micro. They kind of sputter along as 2% of the industry. Outsourced manufacturing was 4% of manufacturing for all of the 70s, all of the 80s, until you start to have a series of providers that are like, I'm here, I know this is a big deal to hand this off to someone else. And so I've got to be able to promise you that I can do it as well as when you do it yourself. And in Flex, historically, that hasn't been the promise. If you run Workplace at Raytheon or Zoom, it's not common to have someone come in and say, if you only have 14 people in Scottsdale, we can run your Scottsdale office. And if you look at employee engagement rates or churn, you're going to get just as good of an outcome as when you do it yourself. But if us or others can meet that promise, that's when you see the adoption rate go from 3% to 25%. And this is an industry that has had a little bit of an existential crisis of, are we trying to meet that standard or not? I think we should try to meet that standard.
So when you're listening to the conversations earlier today, you just mentioned, the first panel, and we're talking about RTO. What's your crystal ball when you look at it, kind of when you're thinking how things are going to play out over the next few years? You think we're going to be still talking about this in 2 years from now?
Yeah, definitely. I think this question of how to get people to come into the office and what makes people want to come in is it's not going to be solved next summer. Maybe a couple distinction. Okay, I found the panel this morning really interesting. I imagine most people did. People seem to be nodding, very engaged. A couple things I noticed that are distinct about the way we think about workplace or would talk about it internally, and it's just interesting to hear how it's different when you're running workplace at a company. Um, One is we definitely talk less about the physical space. Like I would say at Industrious, we probably talk 20% about the physical layout of the space and about 80% about the service program, the way people are treated, the food and beverage, the hospitality program, a little more like a hotel or a
Mhm.
restaurant. Like you got to have a gorgeous restaurant, but then day to day, the thing that makes the restaurant fill is a little bit more disconnected from the underlying physical structure. So when we talk about where things are headed, you might notice me leaning a little bit more in the direction of service program, human interactions. That is just a little bit maybe a bias. Part of it is it's really helpful when you're a flex provider because you don't have a boss. Like when you run workplace at a company, what I can detect from talking to a lot of you is you have constituents and you have groups that say they want this, and Peter's talking about all these people with opinions. I think in terms of designing our physical spaces, we can sort of look at what works and what doesn't, try to design an optimized space, and then get going on actually trying to run that space. And then the second would be in the management of those spaces. Um, we measure utilization, yes, less, where you're talking about some physical denominator, which can be a little bit real estatey. What percentage of the space is filled up? And we measure more things like number of visits per week, number of hours spent in the office, things like that. And that, I think, when you talk about where are things headed, are we still going to be talking about this in 2 years? That's where I think a lot of this is headed, is a lot of companies, us included, are going to be getting more and more rigorous about our experimental programs where you measure how many hours a week does the average employee spend and what are the things that would impact that if you believe it's important for people to spend at least some of the week in the office, which I do. So I just want to show you where we're at right now in that journey because I think it is helpful. Like we have, hundreds of thousands of customers. They're all different companies, so you're able to control for some of the unique cultures of any individual company. And again, we're probably running 50 experiments right now. So hopefully I get invited back next year and I can catch you up on where all these came out. But here's what happened basically for us. So we want to measure how often are employees coming in. And these are for industriouses everywhere in the world. Um, and we wanted to try to correlate that to certain things about either the service program or the way that people interact with each other. And what we found was it's all over the place. And that was painful for us because it's hard to, run any sort of experimental program if the data is so all over the place that you can't find any correlation, let alone hopefully causation. And we finally, about 6 months ago, cracked the code to some degree of why the data was so noisy, which is that in any given industrial space, which would be true for any of your spaces, people are commuting from a variety of distances. And commute is such a powerful influence on whether someone comes in or how often they come in that if you don't control for commute, it just looks insane. Some people are coming in 1 day a week, some are coming in 5. And so we started to control for commute and say for any employee, for the people 12 minutes away, how often they're coming in, for the people 28 minutes away. And then you start to see a correlation. And what I love about that is then you can start to run experiments because then you can say, okay, for a given commute distance, how often are people coming in? So for an industrious where, an individual lives 28 minutes away, how often are they coming in versus someone who lives 8 minutes away and can bike to work? And then you can kind of say the things to the right of this kind of line of best fit are the really good workplaces. Something special is going on there because the people who live the same amount of distance away as at other industriouses are coming in twice as often. And the ones to the left of the line are the crappy industriouses. Something is not working about that one because you would predict that if the average distance or for an individual is 10 minutes, they should come in 4 days a week and they're only coming in 2. Basically, this is a little wonky, but you can make an indifference curve and say, for someone to come in 2 days a week, what is the exact level of quality equivalent to for something 20 minutes away that's equivalent to something 5 minutes away. And what we found is this really happens in real life. So this is basically if you mapped workplaces, the dream is this is 4 minutes from my house and it's freaking amazing. But a lot of times you're getting either something where it's close and good enough, or it's kind of far, but it's amazing. And if this theory holds, people would go the same number of times in those. And that's exactly how it plays out. So in the upper left corner, we have a space in Brooklyn at 1000 Dean Street in Crown Heights. We took it over for a competitor. I don't love that space, but it has among the highest visits, highest usage of any Industrious because everybody in that space lives 3 minutes away.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the bottom right corner, we have one called Penn 1, above Penn Station in New York. The average commute there is triple the average commute of the 1000 Dean, and yet it has almost the same frequency of visits per week because that's the most gorgeous Industrious in the world. If you ever want to visit Industrious, please come to 1 Penn on top of Penn Station. So then your question, okay, so what determines what's to the right of the line? We've tried to codify a lot of this stuff, and we've tried to run experiments around it and tried to identify it. And I think the findings are definitely complicated and noisy, but basically, you could identify hundreds and hundreds of things. And what we find is we have a structure that we've put onto these things now, where basically the things that make a little bit of a difference are things that make you feel welcome. This is an inviting space. I feel good when I walk in. The next would be things that make you feel empowered. This morning, people were talking about using the type of space, that's the right fit for the work you're doing in that moment. Everything's frictionless. I have access to the tools I need. The next would be delighted, and I would not underestimate this. Moments of real joy. I went to a lecture that I learned something. I was exposed to a new idea that I never would have been if I were sitting at home. I was taken care of, inspired, and then the most is belonging, really. And that's, I think, the problem is these are probably in order the hardest things for a head of workplace to do. It's easier to create a welcoming space. It's easier to create an empowered space. It's much harder to influence whether people feel a sense of belonging in a space. But for better or worse, the stuff near the top of this list is the stuff that we have found correlates most with people coming in more frequently.
Well, that's the same reason why people work at certain companies. They want to feel these ways. So at Industrious, what are things you've, I guess, have learned over the years?
It's a journey. I don't think we have even great answers on this, let alone all the answers. And it is more complicated with large corporate occupiers. With a 4-person team, they want to meet everyone else in the space. They want to feel part of that. If it's a, 71-person team from Databricks, they're in this odd experience of both being on their own in their own suite, but also sometimes wanting to connect. And I think what we try to do is be very not coercive, very not heavy-handed, create lots of opportunities for people to meet each other, and create very spaces that are very welcoming and are very where people feel like people of every stripe can work there. So one of the early Industrious observations we had was we had spaces that felt more like, and I don't want to knock WeWork, but that felt more like WeWorks. They were younger, they were more male, they were bro-y, and they had a lower sense of belonging. And we had a space in Midtown Atlanta with a guy who was in his early 80s. He'd been retired for 15 years. He wanted to get out of the home. And he would go and he would sit in the common area every day and read the New York Times. And people talked about him. It changed the way they felt. And so we eventually talked to him and said, why are you here? What do you? And he said, I tried different co-working spaces and I felt like it was very clear this was not for me. That it was like, this was meant to attract a certain type of person. And I felt like I was on the outside. And this was the first space I went to where I really felt like I could be myself. I really felt like this was somewhere where I could kind of be honored for who I am. And that's easier said than done. But I think workplaces that can do that, people start to let their armor down. People start to be more open to conversations. And then you got to keep churn low enough that now they've seen the same faces for 9 months or a year. And eventually someone's mother gets sick and people do a drive to, bring food for her or something like that. And then now you have a space with an enormous amount of belonging. And then it's very sticky.
So looking to the future for you guys now, I mean, do you see going more into submarkets, more into the community as opposed to being like in a central business district? Like I know Dror Poleg is going to talk later. He talks about the future of cities. How do you see this playing out too for your guys' strategy?
Yes. I would say before the pandemic, 70% of our spaces were in CBDs,
Yep.
30% were in neighborhoods. If you look at the last 50 industrious we launched, and the next 50, it's more like 70% in neighborhoods, 30% in CBDs. And I think obviously one of the great promises, it's a little harder for large companies to do this sometimes, is to give people the ability to do both. I can walk to my Brooklyn location a couple days a week, and I can go meet all my colleagues in Times Square 2 days a week as well. But in general, our network and office in general is underserved in neighborhoods and overserved in CBDs. So that's why our supply growth trends more in that direction.
So mentioned before, obviously WeWork, the news, with the bankruptcy, and we'll see how that's going to play. But how do you feel that moving forward, the relationship between flex space providers and commercial landlords may change as a result of what's happening this week, basically?
So I'm completely biased here. Some of you might know this, some of you might not. But if you said, what are the differences between Industrious and the rest of the flex industry? Number one is the thing I said, which is just, I do think we're the only one that really views this as an outsourcing industry and thinks that the key to success is to be able to promise an occupier, we can do this as well. You can get as good as an outcome as you do it yourself. The second big distinction is we have a different business model where we do management agreements with landlords, much like the hotel industry does, rather than leases.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been very helpful for us because it made it much easier to survive the pandemic, and it makes it easier to deliver a good product. You're arm in arm with Blackstone, so you can make sure that the key cards sync with the elevator, or if there's a horrible security guard that's treating people poorly, you can get that taken care of. But I think the industry is going to move in that direction. So basically, very few of these WeWorks are going to shut altogether. This is how it will play out. They're going to go into bankruptcy, they're going to negotiate with landlords, and then they get to choose whether to reject the lease or give essentially an offer for some amended version of the lease. And then it's in the landlord's court to either accept that or reject that amended deal. Basically, some set of units, the landlord and WeWork will agree on some revised deal. It'll keep operating as a WeWork. Many they won't, and either an operator like Industrious or IWG will go in and take over that space, or in the very challenged spaces that are way too big, 500,000 square feet, they'll probably shutter 2/3 of it and turn it into a 100,000 square foot flex space that in turn would be operated by the landlord or by someone like us. So I don't think people who have a lot of flex space, you're not going to wake up tomorrow and it's like now been turned into like, Best Buy back office. It'll still run as a flex space. Hopefully a great provider comes in, or WeWork coming out of bankruptcy runs it. But I don't think it'll be as disruptive as people think.
Okay, well that's positive. I mean, are you guys looking to see some opportunities now? And
Definitely, I think our board is more optimistic about this than I am. So we've taken over 10 WeWorks historically, and it went okay.
okay,
If you looked at, basically had to put in $2 million to upgrade them, and if you looked at our bottom performing units, many of them are those ones. So we haven't cracked the code. There are 200 of the 750 WeWorks we would like to take over, but I think we would have to start a second brand, like Courtyard by Marriott or, Hyatt Place. And we haven't decided whether that's a good idea or not. In the Q&A, I would love to ask if anyone in the audience has an opinion, because that's like we got to make that decision this week.
well, I heard you spoke about this on a BizNow podcast earlier this year about brand and how
Yeah.
historically the workplace and doesn't really have a brand. You're talking about hotels. WeWork has good brand equity, so they can survive on that. But do you feel that that's something too, is looking to the future, then this industry, obviously in the flex space, that the importance of brand?
I think separate from the corporate brand, the logo, I think any workplace that any of us runs, people have a choice. It's got to represent something in people's mind. Like, this is a really welcoming place. This is a very intellectual place. This is where I go to learn and have an edifying experience. And so I would say even at the micro level, you need to have some thesis
Yeah.
for what is the brand of this space. And then in a big global company, that's what we're struggling with. Can you have one consistent brand across 300 spaces in Singapore, in Argentina, in New York, in London, or do you start having to have more like Marriott does, a subset of brands? But in general, I would say the most relevant thing to anyone here is that any workplace, it can't be neutral right now. It's got to have a thesis for what it represents to the user.
Yep. So just moving on to technology, you of course are sharing here some of the things that you guys are doing with tracking and data. Um, you've mentioned that you've tested a lot of things. What are certain things that have worked really well that you're excited about, and maybe certain things that you've invested in and you say, look back now saying it's not really that important?
We bought a company called Pivot Desk. We bought a company called Breather. We have not cracked the code, and I think Mark from Liquid Space is here, of the sort of aggregators, and I wish we could, because I think it's a very interesting way for certain types of customers to buy flex product. Is I'm going to go 2 days to Industrious, 3 days to a local provider or something. That's been a little bit of a wipeout for us on the technology front. On the other hand, the thing that I have seen the most reward for, and this is relevant to any workplace in the world, is that as people have gotten more comfortable working horizontally, I work from my living room on Monday, I go to Midtown on Tuesday and Wednesday, I might go to my local space on Thursday, they've also become more comfortable working vertically across a building. So it used to be you had a partner at Ernst & Young, and you said, actually, all of our meeting rooms are booked on the 39th floor. I've got you in one of the building common meeting rooms on the second floor. That partner would be livid. I mean, would really
Yeah.
be like, what disrespect are you trying to throw on me right now? And all of a sudden now people are much more comfortable moving around in space, going down 3 floors. Um, and the problem with that is the level of technology necessary to make that work. It really has to feel frictionless. You have to feel like, I know exactly what the meeting room is that I'm going to. I know how to get there. Everything people were talking about this morning, that was hyped a lot pre-pandemic and maybe not existential. Now, a really wonderful digital overlay that makes for a frictionless experience of moving in physical space and knowing where you're supposed to be and feeling like you're able to access it in a seamless way. Now that actually is more existential.
So knowing this audience here, corporate real estate, workplace leaders, what's a question that you have for them?
I mean, I had the brand question, but that's more for you as business people. But I think um, if you, a lot of people, so the biggest problem with Industrious is it's expensive. Like our revenue per desk is about $830 per desk. WeWorks and IRGs are both 500. That doesn't mean we're 70% more expensive than in every market, but we are the premium product. And I have had conversations with some of you where it's like, it's a lot, like I would like you guys to be able to lower your prices. If we had a Courtyard by Marriott version of Industrious, would that be odd to go in it? Would you not be interested? Or do you think, would people potentially be interested in a slightly more cheerful, approachable Industrious product at a slightly lower price point? That's a selfish question. I don't.
On that note, does anybody have any questions for Jamie?
Yep. I have a couple, but I'll start with this one. So one of the things that is really important for us as we are going into more flexible or shared co-working locations is the ability to oversubscribe our spaces, right? And that's one of the biggest challenges that we run up against with the service providers is that obviously you have requirements based on code and all that kind of stuff. How are you dealing with that challenge at Industrious?
We we do a lot of that. And I will say, actually, if I had to knock Industrious, number one would be I would love to find a way to lower prices. Number two would be um, there are new ways to buy what we do that are really complex, but an amazing fit for users. So we had a big tech company that basically did HQ for a day every Monday. So they paid for a 100-person suite only on Mondays in our Tribeca location, and it was amazingly efficient for them. Most people don't even know there's such thing as renting an HQ for a day on a 2-year subscription, or things like a mix of private spaces and extra key cards and the ability to seamlessly move across, and then you only pay for what you use. So some of what we are trying to do is just become more fluent and clearer in how we speak about those options. And then yes, I think any provider that cannot say to to a user, you're going to have a space for 29 people and you can have 51 key cards and it costs $100 per month for every additional key card. And if, God forbid, you start having 50 people show up and they're all sitting shoulder to shoulder, then we'll deal with those requirements. I think I would be just as frustrated as you are because that's exactly what I would want if I were using FlexSpace right
The other question I had was that our facilities slash workplace operations teams across a lot of the companies here are going through the mindset change of becoming more focused on hospitality.
now. Yeah.
So, how would you, if you had to pick the things that your teams do that are most stand out around, their hospitality mindset, what would you say?
Um, you got to create roles that are dedicated to this and hire from Ritz-Carlton or wherever else. Like you have to sort of make it a priority. I would read Unreasonable Hospitality, which is the memoir
Hodari, yeah.
yeah, of the guy who took 11 Madison Park from like a mid-tier bistro in New York to the #1 restaurant in the world, just as a guiding star for how crazy you can get and how far you can go to try to create a memorable experience for people. It has to be the focus of training, and people have to be incentivized and tested on that. You have to set a series of expectations around how are people treated, interactions you observe, just like a hotel would, and then listen to the users and really do a lot of surveying on did you feel welcomed? Can you tell me one interaction you had with a staff member in the last month that put a smile on your face? And if no one can remember something from a month ago, you can have all the day in the world. They're probably not being treated like they're at a Ritz-Carlton or an Industrious.
We got another question over here.
Yeah, question about brand, but not your brand. It's more around the client. Do you get concerns from clients around how their brand might be impacted? For example, we're XYZ, our employees expect a certain experience from XYZ, certain standards. Do you get that concern? And if you do, how do you address it?
We do get the concern. One of the helpful things is the concern seems to go up as team size goes up, but also the ability to address that goes up as team size goes up. So if you're a 9-person team, it is hard for us to create a dedicated space with a separate entrance that a client wouldn't actually know was part of a larger, shared infrastructure. If it's an 80-person team, we can do that. And so usually we're able to accommodate that. And there's, in that vein of complexity, there's a new breed of these combination of fixed and hybrid spaces that are really complicated but very interesting. So with JP Morgan, just very quickly, JP Morgan in Palo Alto, their Palo Alto headquarters is half JP Morgan and it's half an Industrious. So the clients go to the JP Morgan side, but the JP Morgan employees can move back and forth between both. We have the same with HSBC in Manchester, England. We're about to announce a big one with two big ones with two of the big Silicon Valley tech companies. But there are a lot of ways to address that. It's harder with, again, a 9 or 10-person team.
We have time for just one very quick question.
It was actually more of an answer.
Okay.
If you took, just from my experience, I mean, Gethin over here from Instant has been great helping, but before he was helping me look for workspaces, we ended up going with one of your competitors. But if you did take over your current competitor and named it In Work by Industrious, and you were able to say, like, listen, you can get this experience for 20% less, but then your co-working spaces, you put in a credit system, single credit to use one of those spaces for a day, double credit to come to a regular Industrious for the day, that would be very appealing.
Okay.
I can run that on a
Okay,
like,
decided.
credit basis.
There we go.
Next time this year,
Born at
there's gonna be
Workspaces.
Industrious Reserve, Normal, and some designation for the more end.
Well, I share with you for some of our staff, we are in a WeWork, but we also use the All Access Pass for staff just to use that, and obviously that's a nice thing that they offer. But I can imagine that's also very tough if more people are buying those options for you guys. Kind of similar to the question before.
I'm a believer in that use. And so it's our job to make it delightful and to make it something that people can really, sort of have a great experience with. But my wife is an Access member of Industrious. She doesn't want to, she's the head of business operations for a robotics company. She doesn't like going into the robotics plant, but she has an Access membership. She comes in a couple days a week and she works in the common area and then books a private office by the day if she needs one. That's what I would do if I were 1 or 2 people. So it's on us to make sure that's a wonderful experience. You shouldn't have to rent a glass box that's dedicated to you and then sits empty when you're not there.
So one quick final question for you. Is there one thing that pisses you off or you're tired of people talking about around the future of work? And
I don't know if people can tell. I'm definitely an optimistic guy. I don't piss off easily. So I would say I have not heard this at this conference. I think that the people here seem to really understand that this is a very human job and that people deserve respect. But I do hear executives sometimes speak in a very demeaning way about specifically young people, but just people who don't know, can't get their head out of their ass and don't know XYZ. And it's going to come back to bite them. It's not how any leader should behave. And I think people are smart and they vote with their feet. And it's on us to create experiences or create a structure for them that works for them where they feel taken care of and they feel invited, not to like dunk on them because they made a different choice than you might have earlier in your career.
Amen to that. I believe it 100%. Thank you so much. We're out of time,
Thank
but
you.
thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much.